The parables, as Pat has said, are ways that we enter into the worldview of Jesus in reference to the reign of God. But they are always placed within a very particular context. So there are two contexts to consider today as we might attempt to interpret what this parable is about. I should say that for us, it's probably a familiar story, and we've heard it often, and we've heard it preached on many times. And the focus becomes a focus on repentance and the generous acceptance and compassion of the Father. And that may indeed be one of the focal points of the parable itself. But if we consider the context in which we find this parable in Luke's gospel, and by the way, this is the only place this parable is found. It's not in any of the other gospels. So it's something very special to Luke and to Luke's community. And remember, Luke's community is a more Gentile community with Jewish members to it, but is probably a more prosperous community, more educated community. And so some of the special concerns that this community has is how are they, as a prosperous and educated community, going to treat the lower caste members in the community or the poorer members of the community. So Luke is always trying to make sure that his vision corresponds to the vision of Jesus, but fits his community. And Luke's community is about 20, 30, maybe 40 years after the time of Jesus. So Jesus's audience is, as described in the story, the Sadducees and the Pharisees. So a part of the challenge is not only, as we hear it today, and have heard it over the years, but also how might this have been heard for Luke's community? And then even more so as we go deeper into it, what must have this story sounded to the Sadducees and Pharisees? And we don't get responses from them, although it's clear at this point in the Gospel of Luke that it just increases their resistance to Jesus and perhaps even their anger at Jesus. So the question they see is they're observing who the associates of Jesus are. And Luke describes it, and we know that there's a whole lot more that could be said, but it involves his association with those who are basically at the edges and margins of the law, those outside of the normal activity and sensibility of the community. Not just sinners, I mean, that might include everybody, but sinners who are of questionable repute, if you will, and tax collectors. And you see, in Jesus's day, tax collectors were people you didn't associate with because they were a part of the Roman bureaucracy, basically. They were Jews, but they took taxes for the Roman state. And so, again, you could imagine the position, social position, that tax collectors would have had. They were not people that you were going to associate with or invite over for dinner. Because if you invited a tax collector to dinner at your house, he'd be looking around the house and going, I don't think you're paying enough taxes here. Look at this house, right? You know how that works. So in any event, that the parable is going to work one level for the Sadducees and Pharisees, it might work at another level for Luke's audience, and it might work differently for us. And that's the challenge for a preacher anyway, at which point am I going to enter into considering this parable today. So I've got a little help here. And now I just lost it. Isn't that how it goes? Oh, no. Well, in any event, the situation for the Sadducees and Pharisees. So when the younger son comes and makes, almost places a demand to the father, it's as if he's saying, because you didn't ask for inheritance until the person was dead. So it's as if the son is saying, you're good as dead, Dad, and I want now what I would get when you're dead. Well, that's going to shock the heck out of that first century audience, because that just was totally against every social convention of the day, that you just didn't do that. The father was head of the house, and it was the father who made such decisions. And what's astonishing is that the father concedes, gives the son what he's asking for. So that must have sounded really strange to that first century audience. And even more as the story unfolds, that you can just hear the audience saying, yeah, this is what happens when you give inheritance to somebody who is totally responsible for what he is given, what they are given. And he goes in, and on top of it, he ends up in a pig pen. And if you're a Jew, that would be the last place on earth that you would want to be. And so it's as if, to the Sadducees and Pharisees' ears, it's as if he's given up everything, his religious association, his cultural heritage, everything he gives up. And he's in the place that you would not ever want to find yourself in. So to the Sadducees and Pharisees, this is just the most bizarre story. And you could imagine they're already grading against the story. It's like they don't want to hear the story at all, right? So as it goes on, the son comes to his senses. But you know what? The audience is saying, you wanted your father dead, and now you're as good as dead yourself. What do you think you're going to get? Because the son says, I'm going to go back and I'm going to, fall on the mercy of my father. And the audience is saying, why do you think he's even going to do that? You don't deserve anything. You're good for nothing. And so you hear that in the audience, perhaps. Sometimes parables, right, we have to read beyond the text to fill in the gaps of the story. So in any event, he goes back to his father, but if you notice it, it's not clearly said, but it's like the father has been waiting for him. Well, isn't that interesting? We're not really told the time span of this, but the father is, this father is one who is watching for his son's return. And when he sees the son, right, he goes out, runs out, without even the son coming to him. At this point, the Sadducees and Pharisees were saying, well, if I was a father, I would be demanding the son make recompense for what he's done to me. And yet the father is so extravagant and lavish that before the son even has a chance to ask forgiveness, the father has already overridden that and lavishes extravagantly his love upon the son. And you would think that's where the story should end. This son of mine has come back, and that could be the end. But the parable goes on because we're asked to consider the older son. Now, the older son was the faithful one. He was the one who stuck it out. He's doing what he's supposed to be doing. And so to the audience, Sadducees and Pharisees, they side with the older son. Because the older son is the good son, not the other one. It appears that the son who's come back ends up being the good son, but the son who was the good son is out in the field. Now, here's the catch, because I could go on with this, but here's the catch. In the ears of the first century, the question, remember, is associating with sinners and tax collectors and those who are outside the law. Now, remember where the younger son has come from. And so the older son, that if we stand in the position of the older son, perhaps as the Sadducees and Pharisees are doing, that we have to move in the direction of the father's response, because if that's how the story is supposed to end, that we're warmly embracing and welcoming back the son who's gone off and rejected his culture, rejected his religious identity, sees his father as good as dead, that's the person we're supposed to identify with. And the older son is asked to come in and share in the welcoming of that son who has no reason at all to be welcomed. Now stop a minute. Do any of those sinners and tax collectors have any reason to claim anything of us? When we could stand as the Sadducees and Pharisees and say, why should we bother with them? They deserve what they get. They've made their choices. Let them lie in their own gutter. So that if the invitation is to consider the perspective of the older son, then we are forced to consider the response of the father having to do with the extravagant and lavish love and compassion for someone who didn't seem to deserve it. And yet, we're not really told what the son does, right? You asked that question of the children. Did the son go in to party? And you said, yes, of course. We're not sure. Because that leaves open the space for Luke's community as well as for us. Are we going to go in without asking questions? Without the baggage that we carry of perhaps some resentment, as the older son seems to express? I've done everything for you. I've done everything you've asked me to do, and this is what I get? Being forced to welcome somebody who squandered everything? Well, what do you think the answer to that question is? Yes, that's what we're asked to do. We're asked to not stand there resentful, angry. We've worked hard for everything that we've got. We've made the effort of trying to be faithful. We've done everything, and this is the thanks we get, that we're forced to embrace and welcome those who are at the edges and outside and margins, who have done nothing for the rest, nothing for their life, and we've done everything. Yes, that's it. That's what's asked. That's what's asked of us. And therefore, in this present time, to ask of ourselves, right? Where are we in this story? Where are we in this story? And if we're going to identify with somebody in this story, then we have to ask, what is it that we're being asked to do at that position in the story? Something in that has to do with the reign of God. Whether it's considering the barriers that social conventions set up, that we expect to be the norms, and to observe the norms of those social conventions in such a way that it has little or no room for the exchange and expression of a lavish and extravagant love. that in those social conventions that get set up and the expectations that go with them, then it's not about lavish extravagance. It's like metering out to what you deserve. You only deserve this. I think of it in conversation one time with nurses at a hospital up in Central Phoenix that had a pretty high number of homeless people in the neighborhood. And we got to discussing what kind of response the Christian worldview asks of us with reference to the homeless people in the neighborhood. And one of the nurses said, it just shocked me. She said, well, we can't care for everybody. We just don't have enough resources. And so let them come to the emergency room and that should be good enough. And I thought, wow. You see how in the social conventions of economics and finance and the systems that we have created, whether it's healthcare systems or whatever it might be, that we meter out a little and feel quite proud of ourselves that we're giving just a little instead of the extravagant and lavishness that is being asked of us. What if we treat the refugee and the immigrant as us, as we expect to be treated? Are we so willing to give extravagant and lavish health care and social benefits and education and housing when we worked hard for it all our lives? Without asking that question, are we willing to be extravagant and lavish in what we give, without strings being attached to it? The Father gives it freely, willingly. He doesn't even say, yeah, son, you're right. You've been with me all my life. And I've given you what I can. But this son that was lost is found. And aren't you also happy with me for that?